Now, let's talk a little bit about structure here, because structure is very important. If you ever look at a person, they will always say this is the structure of Revelation, and one of the most popular structures is the chronological structure. That is, that right from the beginning, it is all going in perfect chronological order right to the end, and everything happens in this fashion. As I was going through the book of Revelation, as I was preaching through it a couple of years ago, I realized pretty quickly that there was a lot of difficulty with that particular approach, because the book jumps back once in a while. All of a sudden, boom, they'll jump back maybe even a couple thousand years from the events that seem to be described. And then they'll jump over here to heaven, and they're jumping around, and it says this can't be chronological. And most of the commentators who are not stuck to chronology and requiring chronology and upset when it gets out of order will say it's not strictly chronological. It does move forward in general time, but there are these reverse cycles to pick up details in the past. Here's an example. Chapter 4 goes into heaven and is really describing an eternal scene where God is described in colors and in sound and in the response of people around him, so that there is an eternal viewpoint there. In chapter 12, we go back to the birth of Christ, the fall of Satan to the earth, Israel's involvement. Here's one of the ways that it's set up, and that is this phrase, "Then I saw." This is what John continues to say. Then I saw, and then I saw. So it is the way it was presented to him in visions. And yet sometimes those visions jump back in time, or they move to a different location. I believe that this is the structure of Revelation. Anybody read Red Storm Rising? It's a great book. My dad told me about it years ago. I read it in maybe 2 days. Hard to put down. But Tom Clancy is a well-known author, but he's writing a novel. And because his novel is really across a large segment of the United States, or of the world really, he jumps back and forth. He goes to Europe, he goes to Russia, he goes to Iceland, he goes to Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado Springs. He's jumping around, like most novels will do that. Grisham does the same thing. Michener does the same thing, going around and backing up and picking up details. That is really, in many ways, what John is doing here, and how the story unfolds. And as it unfolds, just like a novel, it intensifies. It gets more and more intense as time goes on. At the beginning, two opposing forces are identified, and that's pretty typical, isn't it, in a novel, where they'll say, here's the good guy, and here's the bad guy. In Red Storm Rising, here's the Russians and what they're doing, what they're like. Here's the NATO powers and what they're doing and what they're like. In the book of Revelation, these opposing forces are identified and characterized in chapter 2, in chapter 4 and 5 and 7. And in those situations, it is God and Jesus who are identified and characterized. And then in chapter 12 and in chapter 13, the Antichrist and his false prophet are identified and characterized. And all through the book, then, you see these characteristics on display. The characteristics of righteousness, holiness, grace, mercy on the part of God and on the part of Satan. Basically, the characteristic of complete and utter deception. He is identified as a liar, and that everything he says is a lie. And he is ruthless, and he is murderous, and he is awful. But just like in any novel, these people are identified. And then also, like in any novel, there is this coming together into conflict, that these forces, opposing forces, begin to conflict with each other and come into battle, and that battle grows and grows. Chapter 6, chapters 8, 9, 11, 12, and 13. Again, the middle part where there's a lot of conflict involved. And then as that conflict intensifies, then final victory is won in chapters 16 through chapter 22. So if you can get that picture in your mind, that really what you're reading here is a story, but not a story like a fairy tale. It is a description of the end in story form. It is using pictures, vision, to describe what is going to take place, how these forces interact, and ultimately who wins in the end.